to react to that? Let me just tell you what we understand that the state of what we've said is. We've offered no opinion, have no view, have no information on potential impact because it's never something that we looked at.
Okay. So it's not too far of a logical leap to conclude that the assertion that you have told the Congress that there was no influence on the electoral process is not quite right.
Right. It certainly wasn't our intention to say that today because we don't have any information on that subject. And that's not something that was looked at.
Right. Admiral Rogers, before I yield back to the ranking member, there's another tweet that says NSA Director Rogers tells Congress unmasking individuals endangers national security. My understanding was, as a member of the committee, that there is a lengthy and very specific process for the unmasking, but that it does not inherently in of itself endanger national security.
I assume the comment is designed to address the leaking of such information. But again, I have not read what you're saying to me, so I'm not in a position to comment on it, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back to the ranking member.
Mr. Castro. Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your service to the nation and for your testimony today. I want to take a moment to turn to the Christopher Steele dossier, which was first mentioned in the media just before the election and published in full by media outlets in January. My focus today is to explore how many claims within Steele's dossier are looking more and more likely as though they are accurate. First, let me ask you, can you describe who Christopher Steele is?
No, not going to comment on that.
Are you investigating the claims made in the dossier?
Not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay. Well, the reputation of the author, Christopher Steele, as a former accomplished British intelligence officer with a career built on following Russia is important. This is not someone who doesn't know how to run a source and not someone without contacts. The allegations it raises about President Trump's campaign aides' connections to Russians, when overlaid with known established facts and timelines from the 2016 campaign, are very revealing. So let's begin. In general, as my colleagues have discussed before, is it true that a large number of oligarchs and wealthy businessmen in Russia have profited from their continuing close relationships or cooperation with the Kremlin?
Could you say that one more time, sir?
Sure.
I want to make sure I understand.
Have oligarchs and wealthy folks in Russia profited from their connection to the Kremlin?
Yes.
And there are no free lunches in Russia. If you get wealthy under Putin, it's because you support Putin and are expected to support him. Is that fair to say?
I would assume there's a perception of advantage, but I would assume it also varies by the specifics of the particular individual and relationship we're talking about.
Okay. But Putin never just trusts, he verifies, right? As a former KGB man, he wants to keep tabs on his wealthiest citizens, especially those that could ever pose a challenge to him. Is that right?
I assume he maintains knowledge of the situation around him to include particular centers of influence within Russia.
Thank you. So is it likely that the Kremlin would accept or actively trade favors or other valuable or sensitive information, intelligence from foreign figures about Russian oligarchs or wealthy businessmen living abroad?
Is it possible? Yes, but again, it depends on the particulars of the situation. I don't know that I would make a flat statement on that.
But it's certainly a possibility.
It's a possibility.
Okay. Well, the dossier definitely seems right on these points. A quid pro quo relationship seems to exist between the Trump campaign and Putin's Russia. A July 19, 2016 entry, for example, asserts that Russians were receiving intel from Trump's team on Russian oligarchs and their families in the United States. An entry from June 20th, 2016 states, quote, Trump and his inner circle have accepted regular flow of intelligence from the Kremlin, including on his Democratic and other political rivals, unquote, which is something for something. A July 30th entry likewise states that, quote, a source close to the Trump campaign confirms regular exchange with the Kremlin has existed for at least 8 years, including intelligence feed fed back to Russia on oligarchs' activities in the United States. Is it generally true that Moscow actively seeks and supports, whether through the oligarchs, overt Russian officials, or undeclared intelligence officers, sympathetic or cooperative foreign figures abroad, whether through business dealings or political backing or a combination of the two?
I think it's generally true.
I mean, generally, this is a tactic. Generally, it's a tactic we have seen over time. But again, I would caution us. We're talking about very specific cases. theoretically here, and I'm not prepared to get into any of the specifics.
And I know that my colleagues have touched upon this, but I think it's important in the context of Christopher Steele's dossier to bring it up again. So my question is it likely or plausible that the Russians might seek out Americans for Moscow's purposes?
It is one of the focuses of our counterintelligence mission to try to understand the ways in which they try to do that. That's at the core of their intelligence gathering, is try and co-opt, recruit Americans to give them information.
So the dossier states in an entry dated August 10, 2016, that a, quote, Kremlin official involved in U.S. relations, unquote, suggests that Moscow might offer assistance to, quote, sympathetic U.S. actors. Does this sound like a plausible tactic out of the Russian playbook?
I'm not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay, now let's get even more specific. Among the U.S. actors, this Kremlin official mentions are Carter Page and Michael Flynn, whom my colleagues have already discussed at length and which the dossier describes as, quote, examples of successes by the Kremlin official. We know Carter Page went to Moscow on July 7th to give a speech to the new economic school. We're in possession of the slide deck from his speech there. And we know Carter Page obtained approval from the Trump campaign manager at the time, Corey Lewandowski, as reported in Politico, citing National Security Campaign official J.D. Gordon. Now, let me ask you another question with respect to somebody else. Is it correct that Igor Senchin, the president of Russian oil giant Rosneft, is a former member of Russian intelligence and a longtime aide and confidant to Vladimir Putin?
Not going to answer that, Mr. Castro.
In an October 18, 2016 entry, the dossier states that during Page's visit to Moscow, he met with Igor Senchin, offering, quote, Page and Trump's associate the brokerage of up to 19% stake in Rosneft, with Page confirming that, quote, if Trump were elected U.S. president, sanctions on Russia would be lifted. And although, fortunately, the White House hasn't been so naive as to unilaterally lift sanctions on Russia, it was widely reported that on January 27th of this year, Rosneft sold a 19.5% stake in Rosneft in what Reuters calls, quote, one of its biggest privatizations since the 1990s. Furthermore, Reuters reported that, quote, public records show the ownership structure of the stake ultimately includes a Cayman Islands company whose beneficial owners cannot be traced. What a coincidence. Is this the subject of your investigation? One of the subjects of your investigation?
Same answer.
Okay.
Meaning I'm not going to comment.
I understand. So let's move to WikiLeaks for a moment, who played such a prominent role in the 2016 election. As has been established before and reestablished at this hearing, WikiLeaks was at a minimum an unwitting pawn and at a maximum an active co-conspirator of the Kremlin's in publishing stolen DNC and senior Democratic officials' emails. And do you agree this was done in order to offer Moscow some measure of separation as to mask its hand in having hacked and stolen the data in the first place, but so it could still have it publicly posted to inflict damage on the Clinton campaign?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yes.
Okay. An entry from July 19, 2016 in the dossier states that a Trump associate knew that the Kremlin was using WikiLeaks in order to maintain, quote, plausible deniability of its involvement. 3 days after this entry, WikiLeaks carries out the Kremlin's wishes and publishes upwards of 20,000 stolen DNC emails and 8,000 associated email attachments. And the rest, as they say, is history. Another entry, dated August 17th, has Carter Page and a Russian associate discussing WikiLeaks, publishing emails in order to swing Sanders supporters away from Clinton and to Trump. And again, from a September 14th entry of the dossier, quote, Kremlin has further compromising material on Clinton in form of emails and considers disseminating after parliamentary elections in late September. And on October 7th, WikiLeaks publishes John Podesta's hacked emails. So the coincidences keep piling up. Let's turn, in the few minutes that I have remaining, again to Paul Manafort as a follow-up to Mr. Himes' questioning. Suffice it to say, Paul Manafort was a major part of the Trump campaign, including serving as its chairman, convention manager, and chief strategist before departing the campaign in disgrace in August 2016. It's also established the fact that Paul Manafort was a longtime official advisor to pro-Russian Ukrainian political leadership. Is Paul Manafort a subject in your investigation?
I'm not going to comment on that.
All right. Director, can you describe to the American people the Russian concept of kompromat?
It's a technique that they use to gather information on people that may be embarrassing or humiliating and using it to coerce cooperation.
In your career, have you known instances where that has been successfully leveraged?
Yes, I believe our counterintelligence division has encountered it a number of times.
Does that include private places, including places such as hotels that are wired for audio and video?
Oh, come on, yeah.
I don't think I remember enough about the particulars to say, but in theory, sure.
Thank you. I yield back. I yield back to ranking member Schiff.
I recognize Mr. Heck.
What the heck?
Admiral Rogers, before I get into my main body of my remarks, I want to go back to your earlier comment about that there is no evidence to indicate that there was a successful Russian hacking of voter results or tabulations. What I did not hear you say is whether or not there had been any attempts to hack into election systems of any kind.
Yeah. I can answer that because the FBI's responsibility is in the United States. We saw no indication of that. We saw efforts to penetrate voter registration databases, state boards of elections at that level. We saw no efforts aimed at the vote itself.
But you did see
Well, it's the
efforts
same
to
thing.
penetrate registration rolls?
Correct.
There you go.
Did you see efforts to penetrate any other portions of election systems other than registrations? In this country, it's a highly decentralized system. And as a consequence, as you will recall, then Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson indicated that election systems should become a part of our critical infrastructure for cybersecurity purposes.
Their efforts were aimed at the voter registration systems in various states, and it takes different forms in various states. Sometimes there's a private vendor, sometimes it's state, but that's where it was focused and not on the vote itself, vote machines, vote tabulation, vote transmission that we've seen.
Thank you. I yield back to the ranking member. I think
Time's expired. Let me go quickly to Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of statements that have been made up here as opposed to questions, and we don't certainly feel the need to clarify all of them, but there is one aspect that does need to be clarified because it's also involved both of your testimonies. There has been discussion up here concerning the statements by James Clapper, and rather than do the conjecture as it has been made, I'm going to just read it. Chuck Todd said, "Let me ask you this. Does intelligence exist that can definitively answer the following question, whether there were improper contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials?" James Clapper said, "We do not include any evidence in our report. I say